Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. This is a non-judgmental place to explore spirituality, and we're so glad you're here. This is a viewer and listener-supported podcast, so we greatly appreciate your support. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure and like, share, and subscribe to any of the social media content platforms that you're using. And then if you go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, you can make a one-time donation, or with a monthly subscription, you'll gain access to our bonus content. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. All right. Welcome, everybody, to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you tuned in this episode. And today I'm excited to interview David John. And David is, or actually most recently, Associate Dean of the UMKC Medical School.
Until very recently, yes.
Until just a few weeks ago, right? Or months ago?
Yes.
Months ago. Yeah. So you're edging towards changing the pace of your life now, right?
I am trying.
So, and we met a few years ago. I can't remember how long ago, but at least 2 years.
At least 2 years ago.
At least 2 years ago. And I have grown to greatly admire and appreciate David, and he's been a blessing in my life. So I kind of wanted to have him share some of his story. And our stories met probably because both of us are in recovery. Mm-hmm. I don't think we would have met otherwise, right?
Probably not.
So so that just is a little teaser for people. We're not going to start there, but we're going to get there as we talk through your story. But thank you so much for joining us on Spirituality Adventures. So I always like to start with your origin story, a little bit of your background, like where you were born, where you grew up, kind of maybe give us a little idea about your family and what it was like growing up in your family. Okay. Give us a little bit of your early years growing up.
Born in Springfield, Missouri. My parents moved to Kansas City when I was maybe 4 or 5. Oldest of 3 kids. I grew up in Kansas City in the suburbs, the son of a police officer, and my mom was a supervisor at Western Electric out in Lee Summit. So I was always the quiet, studious kid. Bookish, and did well in school. My dad didn't understand how he could have a son like me. You know, my brother was a football quarterback, and I was the bookworm who stayed quietly in his room. So we didn't get along very well, and I left home at 17, and have been independent ever since I left home. Then I planned on going away to college, but couldn't afford it when I left home. So I stayed in Missouri, and I ended up going to medical school here in Missouri, initially with resenting it because I really wanted to be an English professor and write Pulitzer Prize winning pieces, maybe a Nobel Prize. But I got accepted into the 6-year medical school program. I could afford I had to stay in state, so I went. I ended up being really grateful that happened to me. But that's when I started taking care of patients, I realized how lucky I was. So when I was 23, I moved to Honolulu for my internship, planning on staying 1 year. Met my wife, a medical student, and stayed in Hawaii almost 40 years. Very busy practice.
40?
Almost 40.
40 years, okay.
Until 6 years ago. And 7 years ago, I was in Kansas City for some family business, and I happened to be here on a medical school reunion weekend. I, at the last minute, went to a reunion function. One of the deans said, "Why don't you come back and be a professor here?" And I said, "No, thank you. I'm not leaving Hawaii." And, but I went back home, and I spent 2 or 3 months thinking about the job I was offered, which was the perfect job for me at that point in my life, something I wanted to change to do. And about 3 months later, I called Dr. Waldman back and said, "I'm coming." And so I started the medical school April Fool's Day 6 years ago. And I've never regretted coming back to Kansas City, and I've never regretted this decision. As much as I miss Hawaii, I made the right decision. And now I'm going to stay in Kansas City. I have so many personal ties here that I thought I'd move back to Hawaii, but I don't think so. And And but I did step down from being associate dean, and I'm stepping away from my medical school obligations and trying to learn how to take more time off and travel more and play harder and those kind of things. But I'm a workaholic, and so I'm making small steps.
Yeah. Well, we know how important small steps can be, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. So I'm curious. You are now a gay man, right? Is that okay to say?
Absolutely.
And yet you just told us that when you went to Hawaii, you married your wife. All right.
Correct.
So I love digging into some of these things. So like, so how, like in terms of your sexual orientation growing up in Kansas City, when did you first, tell us about that. How does that work? So you got married to a woman, you have 2 daughters, right?
Correct.
2 daughters, and those are adopted daughters.
Correct.
Okay. But I'm kind of curious about that part of your life, if you don't mind talking about it.
Sure. I think that for the first half of my life, I consider myself bisexual. And when you fall in love with someone, you become attracted to them. At least I did, no matter what sex they were. And so before I met my wife, I had relationships on both sides, more women than men, and I didn't want to settle down. I didn't want to get married. I was only 26 when I got married, but my wife was just too perfect, too beautiful, too intelligent, too exciting, and we had a wonderful marriage for the first 10 years of it. And then she had health problems that at a young age that caused her to become a very bitter person, and it was my fault. And so she thought. So anyway, the last 10 years weren't so easy, but by the time I left my marriage, I remember I told my ex-wife that I wanted a divorce after a Father's Day from hell. And that next Wednesday, I had already been sober a year. I was at an AA meeting, and I shared that I was getting a divorce at an AA meeting, and this cute guy had been hitting on me for months, hit on me again after the meeting, and that's when I started with Tom. And so, but I was very happy in my marriage. So I'm not totally gay, but I think that now that I've sort of taken another path, and I find it easier. Relationships with men to me are easier. And so, but I could still fall in love. Whoever I would fall in love with, I think I would be attracted to. Okay. If that makes sense.
I've always had the idea that you could fall in love with more than one person. I mean, maybe I'm not saying necessarily at the exact same time or anything. I'm just thinking like in over the course of a lifetime, you can, I don't know. I just think, I don't know. Yeah. I'm not trying to say that to be against monogamy, or I'm not talking necessarily about polyamory or anything like that, but I think you can fall in love and then not, and then that can ebb away, right? I mean, I know I fell in love with my wife for sure, but I also think we moved apart, right?
Yeah.
And then now, like, I'm open to new love, that kind of thing. So
it's really hard to imagine that in a 50-year relationship, you wouldn't evolve, change, and often grow away from each other, and it's nobody's fault. And so if one relationship does grow distant, then it opens up for others. Now, I'm a lover, so I love lots of people in various ways, but to be in love and have a romantic relationship with more than one person at a time, I could do it. I wouldn't dare do it because somebody will get hurt. We're just too human.
Yeah.
But I could do it. I can love more than one person at a time, but I wouldn't because like the relationship I'm in now, I would never do something to hurt Ricardo, and I think that would probably hurt Ricardo.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's possible.
Yeah. I'm like growing up, I think we're pretty close in age, I think. And so like you're growing up in the 70s as a teenager, right? And being gay in the 70s, like I'm thinking back on my high school experience. Like I know now there was at least one or two or three people that were gay, but they didn't talk about it. They didn't know it. I mean, there wasn't, in fact, they would have hidden it. I'm quite sure, you know? So I'm curious how you navigated, how did you navigate that? And then you get married to a woman, and were you just able to bury that part of you, or
I guess it was
just
or suppress it or something? But I was very satisfied in my marriage as long as we were happy together, and because I loved my wife. And but even going back to high school days, it would have been probably suicidal to be too out about it. But at the same time, people. How do I say this? I happen to be the bookwormish type kid whose friends were all jocks. So, I was really close friends with football and basketball players in my class, and sometimes at sleepovers they initiated things that you wouldn't think straight guys would initiate. So even back then it was kind of quietly things happened, but with these really macho guys.
Interesting.
So I think everybody's curious. It's a matter of, even if you're straight, you're just sort of sexually curious when you're 17 years old, and also you're so sexually charged that almost anything looks interesting at times. Right. So, but as far as being public about it, and then my dad couldn't have handled it either.
Yeah. Well, and I think today, kids that are entering into adolescence are really exploring their sexuality through pornography. I think the statistics show that now, that kids are, the LGBTQ world is more open. The kids are thinking about, well, what am I? Yeah. Like I never thought that question. I was a guy, and I've always been heterosexual, so the thought never even came into my mind that there were more options for me, But I think kids today actually are exposed to more options through a lot. I think through pornography. I actually think there's hard.
It's not just pornography. It's just social media.
Yeah.
Social media that's not pornographic is still exploratory, and it is affirming to people who, like, I have a trans niece who maybe is alive today and didn't commit suicide simply because of social media support. Because she was locked away in her room and homeschooled when it came out that this was a problem. And so, problem to her parents. So, but she's doing fine. And
but found the love and acceptance she needed to be
on social media.
Was. Yeah, interesting.
And so that was her life, because she wasn't allowed to socialize. I think it's sad to have 1,000 friends on social media, and maybe not any in real life. I'm not that type of person. I don't do social media, but I do think that for somebody who's alone and thinks there's nobody else in the world like them, maybe it does save them. And that's not pornography, but pornography is so accessible to kids now. Yeah. So I wonder if that kind of desensitizes them and things are, I don't know.
I'm going to be pursuing interviews with people, that are sex therapists and that kind of thing, and how that plays in with kids today and all that kind of stuff. It fascinates me. I grew up in what I would say was a very shame-based sexual ethic, growing up in, this evangelical religious world. The sexual ethic I was taught or absorbed, and it wasn't so much my parents as much as the church world that I was in and, felt a part of because I felt called to be a pastor. But my sexual ethic would have been, well, God made sex, and if you're heterosexual in a heterosexual marriage, actually, you can do it. But if you're not in a heterosexual marriage, you can't do it, and you can't think about it. Because we had this idea that lust was wrong. And how I conceived of lust was thinking about sex. So I was always trying, as a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid that felt called to be a pastor, like, not to ever think about sex. And it's like, you can imagine I wasn't very successful, right? And then even as an adult, and even in the marriage I was in, it was like, I felt shame about my sexual, or just my sexual, not even my sexual identity, just the fact that I had sexual feelings, sexual thoughts, sexual emotions, sexual fantasies. I felt guilty and shamed about that, like my whole adult life almost, And now I'm like going, holy crap. Like, I feel sad about that, right? And then I think that's caused so many people to have, like when I talk to people in the LGBTQ world, the one thing we usually share is some type of shame-based ethic. So many of my friends that are in the LGBTQ world grew up in environments where they tried to pray the gay away or pray their sexual identity away because they felt shame about it and they hated themselves, right? Like self-hatred was a huge, huge part of some people's, sexual identity until they either hated themselves, wanted to kill, and then they finally had to stop doing that, right? And start finding out ways to affirm themselves, love themselves, sex positive messages, all that kind of stuff. But I look back now on that and I like, holy crud, I bought into a whole big worldview that I think actually is damaging now. I really do. So I'm doing my best to try to reverse course on that and, try to have sex positive messages. And I don't know. I'm curious, did you struggle with the shame base?
Not at all. I'm really lucky. I didn't have, first of all, I was very well read. When I was in 8th grade, I was reading college material, War and Peace kind of stuff. And so I saw the world as an adult, when I started having sexuality issues. I had an adult education about things, number one. Number two, I didn't have any significant religious influence growing up, one way or the other. In fact, most of the religious influences I had were negative. And so I dismissed them. And so I didn't have religious shame, and I didn't really have a personal shame. But that doesn't mean I was stupid about getting negative sanctions from my environment, but I personally did not. But I think I'm very unusual. And I'm very grateful that I escaped all those shame-based things. And I have been shamed by other things, but they weren't my sexuality.
They didn't revolve around your sexual identity or your sexuality.
No, and then if.
I think that's a blessing.
Yeah, it's a huge blessing, and logically, if we were not supposed to be sexual beings, why is every human being on the planet a sexual being?
Exactly.
And so, other than reproduction,
it's insanity.
Yeah, it is. It is.
It's insanity.
That doesn't mean that there's not healthy and unhealthy sexual practices, but they're not restrictive to the missionary position, a heterosexual missionary position. Right. And so I think that I was spared that. Yeah.
Yeah, and your sexuality is broader than just your, broader than just sex, but it has to do with your identity and the way you think of yourself and the way you relate to the world, and
that's a spectrum too. Mm-hmm. I consider myself very male. It's not like I have any. Anyway, I was lucky, and I think I'm a minority.
I think you are, but I think it's a good minority.
Yeah,
and I honestly think, I even think of it in terms of like if I was raising kids today, if I had my own kids and I was raising my kids, how would I want to raise them in a sex positive kind of environment and still help them navigate healthy sexual boundaries, right? Mm-hmm. But have sex positive messages that their sexuality is a gift and that it's, there's nothing to be ashamed about having sexual desires, sexual thoughts, your sexual identity, like all of that. So I tend to think of it through those lenses, but man, so many kids today have been raised up in these religious environments that it's shame all the way down.
I think it's a form of cruelty.
I do too.
And I think you can discuss sexuality in the context of caring and of love. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily being in love, that doesn't happen every day, but being in caring relationships and loving relationships where I think almost everybody would agree that sexual experiences are so much more valuable, so much more rewarding. For instance, I don't watch pornography. I think it's boring. And I don't want anything to do with that kind of stuff. Not because I'm better than, because I'm bored by it. It doesn't have any warmth to it, and it has no humanity to it. So I think you can teach your children to find to not be ashamed of their sexuality, but also to teach them that it's best in the context of a loving relationship.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dive back. So you're married, you're in Hawaii, you do your internship in Hawaii. We're going to jump backwards into your story here a little bit. Give us a little feel for David John in Hawaii, starting out his medical career and his marriage, and that you had a long career there.
I did.
So give us a little bit of your sense of your career, your family, and then what started happening that ended up causing you to have to go to rehab.
Okay.
All right.
Well, backing up a little bit more than that.
Okay.
I gave up drugs and alcohol for the first time when I was 17 because my dad was a narc, Kansas City Police narc, and we didn't get along. So I got kind of enjoyment out of doing drugs under his nose. But as soon as I left home halfway through my senior year in high school, it was no fun anymore. So I pretty much gave it all up except for booze when I had the time. But I put myself through school, so there wasn't that much time. Halfway through my internship, I had a bloody nose. Wouldn't stop. I went to ER, got admitted, had an angiogram, had a tumor. They wanted to take my face off. I said no. So there was this long struggle with my surgeons, and finally I agreed to a nasal through my nose getting a biopsy, and it was a benign lesion. They could get that through my nose. But scary week, and I really had a lot of thinking to do, laying in that hospital bed for 5 days fighting with him. And after that, I went crazy.
Had you completed your
halfway through my internship?
Okay.
It was over Christmas. And so so I went wild. And I found every bad place in Waikiki and I almost got kicked out of my internship from being the model intern to being a guy who was late for call because I couldn't find my car. And it was horrible. And then this beautiful, amazing 3-time valedictorian woman wanted me. I think she wanted a bad boy. And so I gave all that up, and I got out of Waikiki, and I was faithful to my marriage for 20 years. But she saved my life because those were the AIDS days.
Wow.
And I would have died, I'm sure, with my behavior. So that's the second time I cleaned it up. And then the first 10 years of marriage, she's a doctor too, and all we did was think about work and getting ahead and building a big house on the hill and all the wrong things. And we didn't take time for each other, but we were very successful. And everybody thought we had it all. But our, life was just so stressful and busy.
Talk about what were you doing? Where were you working? And where was she working? And
she's a dermatologist, still practicing, and she had her own private practice in Honolulu. And I was a rheumatologist who initially joined a large clinic called Straub Clinic, and after 6 years went in private practice. And so I had a private practice, the biggest hospital in Honolulu, the Queen's Hospital. And so we were both extremely successful professionally, and kind of like a power couple in this community. Mm-hmm. And but we didn't take time for each other. Not that we didn't care. We collapsed when we got home at night. And then she had serious illness in her early 30s that shook up our relationship, and it was, I couldn't repair it. And so without going into details on her issues, our happiness spiraled into unhappiness, and we had 2 little girls. And so I tried to hang on, and I found that anesthetizing myself with alcohol helped me cope at night with a bitter, unhappy wife. And but then it got to the point where you go from abuse to suddenly being an addict, and that's then your behavior changes to where my children were important, but my bottle of scotch was more important than anything. Because if it wasn't, why would I drive drunk with my little girls in the back of the car? If the drinking wasn't more important than my daughters, alcohol became more important than anything. And usually in addiction, you hang on to your profession to the end, because that's how you make money to buy your drugs. So I managed to, when I told my staff I was an alcoholic and putting myself in rehab, they all couldn't believe it, because I was a highly functional 2/5 of scotch a night drinker. I don't know how I did it. And
you were in your 30s?
I was in
this is going
well,
40s?
I went to rehab when I was 43. So the last 2 or 3 years were bad. So 40, 41, 42, 43, those were the bad years.
And how old were your daughters then?
Little, because we adopted them later. When I got divorced, they were 8 and 11.
Okay.
And so they were the years up to that, but I was the domestic one of the two. I was the one who put them to bed. I was the one who read them bedtime stories as long as I could stay sober enough to read. And it just got, at the end, it got very, very horrible. And then Father's Day 96. I went into a rage. I never lose my temper. I went into a drunken rage and was physically abusive to my firstborn. And she started crying, and I started crying, and I had my moment of clarity when I realized I'd become my father. And I wasn't willing to do that to my kids. So I knew I had a friend of mine in Kona who was in recovery, and I called up Steve and said, can I talk to you? I need help. And he said, sure. And I said, can I fly over to Kona? So I flew to Kona, and I spent the day with him, and we went up in the mountains, and he hunted goats with bow and arrow. And I watched him shoot a couple of goats with his bow and arrow. But he told me about his path and how he tried one more thing before he committed. So he had planned out a suicide to save his family, but he was going to try one more place. And it was a place in Atlanta that specialized in doctors. And so I went home and I booked a flight to Atlanta, and I checked in on 7/7/97, and I signed myself into an acute psychiatric hospital for detox. And when I signed my name on that piece of paper, I felt such relief. I felt it was over. It was over, and it really was over. Unlike other people, I didn't have to relapse. And so I was there 5 months. They did what they wanted me to stay longer, but it was Christmas time, and I hadn't been allowed to talk to my kids on the phone for a few months, and I was going insane. And so I went home on December 6th and went to a halfway house. I had to agree to live in a halfway house. So I had a $3 million house on the hill, and I lived in a $300 a month halfway house with a bunch of meth addicts and cockroaches and centipedes, and I was happy there.
This is after you got out of rehab.
After 9 months of rehab, I had 4 months in the halfway house.
Wow.
And so I would drive up to my house, which wasn't too far away, make breakfast, drive my kids to school, go to work, come home, make dinner, wash the dishes, leave for an 8 o'clock a.m. meeting, and then go to my halfway house to sleep. And that was the way it was for 4 months, so I could see my kids.
But I'm going to back you up just a little bit.
Yeah.
Before you went to rehab.
Yeah.
So you've got these young daughters, you're putting them to bed, but your marriage is not doing well, and you're drinking every night. At the worst, you were drinking 2/5 of scotch, and
some nights.
Yeah. And but you guys are both. I mean, you're hanging out. You're going golfing with the governor.
Yeah.
You're on the Healing Board of Arts in Hawaii. Is that right?
I was involved with some of the politics, but after I got back from rehab was when I was involved more with that.
Okay, well, I'm still before you went to rehab.
Before I went to rehab.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, like, you know my story, my story went public, for Kansas City, I was, all of a sudden this megachurch pastor goes to rehab, and there was a front page Sunday edition article, megachurch pastor goes to rehab, 2-page article. I was an alcoholic, an addict, and an adulterer, which is not what I wanted to be known for at the age of 57. I hadn't lived my life to make that headline. I think you had a little bit of a similarity in that your story went public as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm kind of jealous because I wasn't on the front page of the paper.
Oh, gosh.
I didn't excel quite as much as you did, but I was gone for 5 months, and when I was so much so visible that people were asking where I was at, and of course, my wife was glad to tell them, and so was some of my neighbors. They were very gossipy, and Honolulu is a big small town, so the gossip went pretty wild. And so then I come home to that, and I had to hold my head up high, and my patients, a few of them heard, and they would say something like, "I hear you've been having some troubles." I said, "Yeah, I was really not very healthy, but I'm really good now." And he said, "Well," and they were all wonderful. They would say, "We're so glad you're back, Doc, and we're proud of you." And they were my patients were wonderful and non-judgmental. And maybe I lost a few, so I didn't see those, but my practice didn't decrease at all when I got back. But my fellow physicians had trouble because we're not supposed to get sick. Mm-hmm. We're not supposed to be weak. And so I made them very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And I had to hold my head up high because it was kind of lucky that I thought everybody knew, because then I didn't have to. I hate lying. I won't lie anymore. And when you're an addict, you lie. And so one of the things that gives your self-esteem back is rigorous honesty. And so I don't lie about anything. I will keep my mouth shut sometimes to be polite, but I thought everybody knew, so I just acted like everybody knew. And I found out who my friends were and who really didn't care about me as a friend. Mm-hmm. And so it culled all those people out. I mean, ended up being good. And then 1 year to the day, the next Father's Day, was when I told my wife I was divorcing her. And the next Wednesday, I started dating Tom, whose father was extraordinarily, he was sort of like the Women and Children's Hospital, the most prominent OBGYN of the century kind of a guy. So everybody knew Tom. And so I was outed in the medical community about being gay 1 year later, and had to hold my head up again. But Honolulu is a pretty liberal city. So it wasn't as bad. And so, but I just learned to get, thick-skinned is not the right word because I'm not so thick-skinned, but I just figure that there's a saying in AA, if whatever you think of me is none of my business. And so if people don't like me, I have so many friends. If you don't like me, that's fine. I don't want to waste time with people because I have friends I don't have enough time for. Yeah. And so I'm not worried about other people's opinions of me because I have enough.
Yeah. I've heard you share a story several times where you're coming out of rehab. So you'd been at Talbot for what, 9 months? 5 months, sorry. 5 months. And, there's this higher power thing that we talk about in the 12-step world. I'm kind of curious, like, what was your spiritual perspective maybe before you got into the 12-step world? And what's your spiritual perspective now after you've been in the 12-step world now for over 25 years? But I want you to tell the story on the plane ride home too. So you see where I'm framing this up a little bit. But anyway,
I see what you're doing. First of all, my experiences with organized religion were negative growing up. And I was kicked out of Sunday school in third grade. And I don't even remember why. I probably just asked the question why. And my grandmother quit the church because I would go in the summers with her to church because my parents didn't go to church. But so I had lots of negative things about organized religion. And so I thought, well, I still want to be a spiritual person. I had no idea what spirituality was about. And I was just a workaholic. And I think I was even then a humanist, but not to the degree I am now. So I went to rehab, and they started talking about this higher power all the time, and the literature refers to God a lot. It was written in the 1930s. Some of it was lifted directly from the Episcopalian Book of Common Prayer, because one of my friends gave me a Book of Common Prayer, and I said, anyway. So it's very Christian terminology used, and a lot of the reference to God. And I was sitting there thinking, I can't make it because I can't do a higher power. But then after a couple of months, one of the triumvirate there mentioned in a talk that gratitude is a form of spirituality. And I was thawed out enough after a couple of months there to realize I have a lot to be grateful for, and I can do gratitude. And so that was and I'm still extremely grateful, man. And that is sort of the beginning of my spiritual experience. As far as something higher than myself, I had trouble, something more powerful than myself, which is really important to have, I think, if you're trying to stay clean and sober. I had trouble with that. And but then a few things started happening. I think the one you're referring to, near the end of my rehab, they let us go home for long weekends to see how things would go. And so I would fly from Atlanta to Honolulu and then back, and they would give me like 4 days, 1 day travel time on each end and 2 days at home. And I was flying back to Atlanta after the first one on a night flight. And there was a 2 seats, 22A and B on Delta. And in those days, they put the nocturnal bar in the aisle, and they put it right in front of 22A and B. And I had a really difficult time trying to interface with my then wife in those days, flying back to Atlanta, feeling frazzled, hurt, angry, all those negative things. And this bar was placed in front of me for a flight nonstop from Honolulu to Atlanta. And I started getting squirrely and squirmy, and I pulled out my 3 3-month coin, and I pulled out my big book, and I'm trying to just think about staying sober. And the guy next to me, he was B, in 22B, he looks over to me and says, "What's wrong with you?" I said, "I'm really uncomfortable." And he looks over at the bar, and he looks back at me, and he said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "My name is Jack. I've got 23 years," or something like that. It's a certain amount of years. And he shook my hand, and he talked to me the whole flight. He talked to me, and he calmed me down. And by the time I was fine with that bar sitting there with Jack right next to me, and him talking to me and talking about putting things into perspective. And he saved me because I would have gotten off the flight shit-faced and bad, drunk, and I would have, they'd have kept me forever, you know? And so he saved me. He was there for me. And so I started thinking, that seems more than coincidence that somebody was there when I needed him. And it was another human, but it felt powerful, and it felt, and so I started being a little more open to things like that. And I do at this point feel that there's something mystical about life that I really can't define, but I'm okay with that. I'm just knowing that there's something mystical that has kept me from drinking for 25 and a half years. I'm just grateful for that too. But I can't really define it any better than that. But I guess that's my spirituality.
Yeah. Well, I love that, especially the gratitude part. I think that's such a critical part of spirituality and of sobriety. You know, I'm kind of curious. Like for me, I've only been in the program now for 3.5 years, but you know, as I've gone through the literature and, you know, lived in the program now for 3.5 years, one of the things that I've realized is like, gosh, I mean, this is just like, I don't know anybody who wouldn't benefit from living the program, alcoholic or not, addict or not, like just human beings, you know? And so part of what I do, you know, even when I write blogs and stuff like that, is I kind of try to sprinkle in a little bit of AA, a little bit of Jesus, a little bit of just, you know, sound mental health and good, you know, love God, love your neighbor, love, forgive, you know. But the program really, in my mind, there's not anybody on the planet that wouldn't benefit from the principles that are in the 12-step program. And you've walked this out now for 25 years. You've been in, you know, the medical world, friendships, relationships, all just your whole world for 25 and a half years. You've been living this program. What principles have you found to be most important to your recovery? I know it's maybe a big question. And then how have you, I'm trying to think of how I want to ask this question. I didn't pre-think it. Have you found opportunity to present the program to people who may be not even alcoholics or addicts? I'm curious about, I don't know. First of all, maybe the first question is just what are some of the key principles that you've really latched onto that have helped you not just in sobriety, but just in life in general? Let's say it that way.
Well, first of all, for people who don't know what the 12 steps consist of, they're, like you said, they're really rules for clean, good living. And the first one is about admitting you're powerless. The second and third about addressing the higher power that will help you to stay clean and sober. The 4 through 11 are talking about being a decent human being, making amends for things you've done wrong. And then the last one is taking care of the person who is still suffering. Now, if every human being did step 12, whether they were sober or not, we wouldn't have the poverty. We wouldn't have the wars that we have. Step 12 is something we all should do. And by 12 step of AA is what has kept me sober, I think. So I think that it is good for everybody. When I came back from rehab, I was monitored for 5 years. Most physicians are. They have to drop urines and all this. There's a monitoring body. And after 4 years, I was asked to sit on that body. And I said, I can't sit on this body because I'm still being monitored by you. So they let me out a year early because I was sort of a model drunk, in sobriety. So anyway, so I was on the state of Hawaii board that monitored physicians and dentists and veterinarians and PhD psychologists and stuff. And the last 10 years in Hawaii, I ran that board. I was chair. And it was a working board. It wasn't a supervisory board. So I was in the trenches for 10 years with freshly discovered doctors with problems. And so I did 12-step work for them all the time. I also had sponsees. I took care of whenever there was a need. I helped what I could when I could, and that made me feel better. And so, but the things from the program that I learned was that gave me my self-respect back, got rid of my guilt and shame over alcoholism and the things it did to my family and such, and the things it did to my patients, was learning to be rigorously honest, always living in gratitude, and always trying to help other people. Isn't that a good Christian way to look at life?
You bet.
And so I still respond to all of those things. And in my practice, before I got sober, a patient would say, well, Doc, I'm starting to have a little trouble with my Valium or my alcohol. And I would shut them up and I'd start talking about their hypertension because I couldn't cope with them having that problem because I had that problem. And so now I'm not afraid to address any of my patients' problems. And the delicate things they bring up, I face it head on with them, and I'm a much better doctor. I'm also more empathetic. I've done my own suffering.
Yeah.
And so I'm empathetic, and I think it's made all the world of difference in how I practice medicine. And it also has made me a better friend, a better father. Everybody needs the 12 steps.
Yeah, I agree. I think the people that I've met in recovery who are working the steps are amazing people. They've become some of my favorite people, right? Like you. But
Thank you.
It's because the honesty, the vulnerability, that connects us as humans, right? And then there's a humility to that. And then there's just the hand that's always there to support, to be there, to reach out. And as I've lived in the recovery world, it's made me even kind of like rethink the church world. Like I think honestly, if you're going to run a church or a spiritual community, it should have these kinds of components into it that we experience in the recovery world, So I've been extremely grateful for the people that I've met in recovery. So thanks for sharing about all of that.
Sure.
One of the things that I wanted to, we're getting close to running out of time, but one of the things that you taught at UMKC was literature, right?
Medicine literature,
which I'm a bookworm too. Even though I'm an athlete, I'm a book nut, right?
I can see.
Exactly. Yeah. One of my other bikes and books are, maybe two positive addictions in my life, right? But,
yeah, good.
Tell us a little bit about your literature medicine course, because that always, just because I love books, that always fascinated me.
Well,
what are some of your favorites, and how do you introduce them to students? And
I had actually two different courses. One of them was medicine and literature. One was medicine and body image. But both of them, I'm trying to raise the humanistic awareness of these students who are kind of nerdy, science-y. Sometimes they've spent their life in front of a computer instead of talking to people at dinner, and so they have communication difficulties at times. I choose my literature depending sort of on what's current. One year we read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, the year that Black Lives Matter came to the forefront. And we also read The Plague by Albert Camus, and to talk about physicians in times of plague, and examine the role of physician society in those kind of situations. So, and then this last year, I had them read, among other things, A Handmaid's Tale. So, because we were talking about, women's rights are threatened right now, and I wanted to address women's rights so that they are the men in the audience could start thinking, well, from a maybe a little bit different perspective, that they wouldn't want to be second class in any way in this country. So that was one of the books we talked about. I had them read When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, which is about a young neurosurgeon who gets diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer when he's a senior surgical resident, and he talks about his illness and his death, and he's very young, and I think these young students could relate to somebody like that, and somebody like that young dying, that maybe they could think about death. We did a lot of poetry because you can get a lot of intense subject matter in a small space. We did books on and watch videos about eating disorders and addiction, and I had a whole week on transgender issues, where I had a transgender young man, a trans man, come in and talk about his experience for a couple of hours, real life. I mean, it was amazing, that 2-hour session with him. So I want to educate them more about that side of being the kind of physician that most patients want, a humanistic physician who is empathetic and will listen and will understand and will accept. Because I say, when you're a brand new doctor and your third patient walks in and stutters out that he's struggling with his sexual identity, and wants to talk to you about it, and the fourth patient wants to talk to you about his alcoholism, and you're brand new minted, are you going to have any kind of frame of reference to rise to those occasions? When you haven't had those life experiences yourself, you can still think them through and be somewhat ready. And that's what I was trying to help them with, because I learned it on my own. And I didn't do a very good job until I did my homework at Talbot. Yeah, right. So anyway, that was my goal.
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating that an experience in life that almost took us out could actually be transformed into something that actually makes us, like for yourself, a better doctor.
Oh, yeah. Much better. And much better at everything in life, I think. When I first got sober, you hear the old-timers, I'm an old-timer, the old-timers say, I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. And I would... Grateful?
Yeah.
I mean, I was grateful for lots of things, but grateful that this happened to me? I understand now. I understand why they say grateful recovering alcoholic, because I'd be dead now, but even if I wasn't dead, I wouldn't be as nice a person. I wouldn't be as genuine a person. I wouldn't like myself. And so I think I just still regret my children had to go through what they had to go through and such. But for myself, it's been a blessing. Yeah.
Yeah. When people would say that when I was first 2 years, I was like, yeah, that's bullshit. Yeah. That's how it felt.
Yeah, me too.
And, but I'm, 3.5 years and like, I'm starting to get glimmers of, okay, well, maybe, and just that all of the crap that I've gone through could I have that hope that it can be transformed into something good,
Oh, I am sure it will.
So that's
I'm certain
I've got
of it.
that hope now, at least.
Good.
So I'm not like cringing when people talk about grateful alcoholic now, which at first I did. Like I was
Me
like,
too.
oh God, this is the most miserable thing I've ever gone through in my life. Like I want to die. I wouldn't care there was a point where I wouldn't have cared if I died or not.
I understand.
Yeah.
Me too. I think my children saved me. I think I would have died.
Wow.
But I couldn't do that to my kids. So I think they're the reason I went. I didn't stay in rehab. I didn't stay sober for my kids. I went there for my kids. I stayed for myself.
Okay.
Because you only stay sober for yourself.
Yeah.
But it took me a while. They're the ones who got me there.
Yeah. Well, grateful for you, and
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. I'm curious, like as we kind of wrap things up, what do you see in the future? Like, where are you going from here?
Oh boy. Well, I'm still obligated 4 days a week professionally, so I only really have 3 days I'm not doing doctoring, and I'm going to do that for another year or two. I'm in a new relationship that I want to evolve. I want to travel more. I am got a couple of big trips coming up this year, and I thought when I was 17 years old I would write novels. So my daughter has sent me these things. My sister is sending me these things. How to write, all these workshop things. They're pushing me. So maybe in 3 or 4 years I'll take some time and start writing.
Interesting. I'm going to be starting a memoir here soon. I'm working with an editor, and actually next week. But I've written only prose all my whole life. I've never written any fiction at all. But I read fiction, and I love it. But I've wondered if I could ever write fiction. It's interesting.
I think I can. I don't know how good it'll be, but people just say, just fictionalize your life story. That's good enough. And because it's pretty colorful and
that could be true. Yeah.
But my answer is they're not all dead yet, so I can't do it. But I think that I might start writing in the next few years.
Yeah. Well, good deal. Well, if I've never been to Hawaii. So
I'm so sorry for that.
So maybe one of these days.
Maybe you'll go when I'm there, and I can show you aloha and the real Hawaii, not Waikiki.
So that's the way I like to experience the world, is through.
I'll take you on. You'll have the most beautiful hikes.
I don't like to do the tourist thing. I like to actually,
Me too.
Yeah. So
if you like to hike, and I have friends with mountain bikes.
Yeah.
Because I know you like to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll show you the real Hawaii.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures, and we'll see you next time. This concludes today's episode. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Remember to like, share, or subscribe to the social media platform that you're using. And then go to our website, spiritualityadventures.com, and make a one-time donation, or you can subscribe monthly and receive our special bonus content. Thanks so much.